When you think of Palm Sunday, do you ever think about what was going on historically and why were all those people carrying palms in the first place? Let's look at it from a historical perspective. Go back into the early part of the first century. We're in Judea. Now, Jeshua and his disciples had moved into Judea several months prior to this, and they'd been converting a lot of people, and they had quite a following, and that following was willing to follow them really into whatever venture that they had in mind. The venture that they were really after, of course, was the overthrowing of the Romans and bringing back an independent, not just Judea, but an independent Palestine. They were going to do this, and the timing was a little tough for them. The time we're talking about now is coming up to the Feast of the Tabernacles, which occurs in autumn of each year, and this is what time of year it was. And this was a particularly important Feast of the Tabernacles coming up because it is one that occurs every 7th year. And in this every 7th year of the Feast of the Tabernacles, the rightful king could enter Jerusalem, enter into the royal courtyard, and stand there in the temple and read from the book, essentially establishing that he was the rightful king. Now, time was coming up. Agrippa was in Rome. He hadn't yet been named king, but they were expecting that to happen at any point in time. Jeshua and his group were essentially the forerunners of this. Their mission was to go into Jerusalem and secure the temple, because essentially what we were talking about now was a coup. It was hopefully a peaceful coup, but Jeshua and his followers were ready for it. So their job was to enter in. Now they were tossing up, should we do this, should we not go in, before Agrippa and the troops get here, because Agrippa was planning to pick up the army as they moved through Galilee on the way down there to Judea. But the timing was too important, and Jeshua felt very confident that Agrippa would be named king. So can you imagine now? Here it is, probably not a Sunday, or we never know whether it was a Sunday or not, but certainly at that time, very close to the beginning of the Feast of the Tabernacles. Jeshua and about 50 of his disciples have organized with their followers that they're going to get into the city, and they're going to go and they're going to take the temple. Now, in Jerusalem, there is a Roman fort. In that Roman fort, there's about 500 or 600 soldiers, and they're probably aware of something going on. Certainly the time was very disturbing at that point, as talk of revolution was going on all around. So what happened is that Jeshua's disciples and crew had arranged for all the followers to be standing around the streets holding their palm branches. Now, it wasn't an unusual thing to him to have palm branches. It goes back to the fact this is the Feast of the Tabernacles. During the Feast of the Tabernacles, sort of like a harvest festival, everybody, all the Jews, would gather palm branches to make the roof of a house, a small house that they would call, or an upper room, on top of their houses. Their houses had flat roofs, and they built a structure on top of that called a tabernacle, and on top of that they used palm branches to cover it up. It was to create a little shelter, and this would be a shelter then for about a week during the festival. Everybody was doing that, so there was no reason for the Romans to be concerned about everybody carrying palm branches at this time. So the timing was perfect. Jeshua and his crew arranged for his people to line essentially the streets, the direct street from the gates of Jerusalem all the way to the temple. They entered, their people were lining the streets, they were holding their palm branches and creating a blockade essentially. So if any Roman soldiers saw them and realized what was going on, they couldn't get through all these people holding palm branches. Imagine then, Jeshua and his people, about 50 disciples, were rapidly moving through the streets of Jerusalem, the crowd shouting out Hosanna, as they did historically at the time of the Feast of the Tabernacles, and that's a real translation to essentially going back to the time of Judges, when the Israelites would call out Hosanna, to an appeal to God to send them a leader, a military leader, to overthrow whoever was bothering them at the time. And in the times of the Judges, this is what happened. And they were calling for one again, and they thought this was the beginning of it. Jeshua and his group managed to get through the streets of Jerusalem. They get to the temple. They're safe there in the temple courtyard because the Romans are not allowed into the temple courtyard. So at that point, they throw back their cloaks, all 50 of them draw their swords, Jeshua picks up a whip, and they start taking on the temple police. They drive them out, because with sheer overwhelming forces, they knock over all the tables, they clear out the temple courtyard, they go into the main part of the temple, they confront the priests, they confront Caiaphas himself. Jeshua takes the whip and whips Caiaphas and gives him a bloody cheek. They drive them all out, and essentially Jeshua and his disciples then have taken the temple, and they're ready to hold it then until Agrippa and the rest of the army can arrive, and they can make the formal announcement that Agrippa is now king, and in payment for all this, Jeshua was to be named high priest. The euphoria lasted a very short period of time, however, because news came within the next few days that Agrippa had been arrested.